Well, Dr. James Kinross, thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate your time in advance.
Absolutely my pleasure to be here and looking forward to talking.
Well, I have your book here, Dark Matter, and I really, really enjoyed reading it. It was like discovering a different planet with how far the rabbit hole goes down. It goes down really deep. I want to start with the symbiotic relationship we have with our microbiome. And if you could just walk us through how important that symbiosis is, because that was the big sort of surprising thing I learned when reading your book.
Yeah. So I think that's a really fundamental component to understanding what a microbiome is and what it isn't. So a microbiome, by definition, is a collection of all microscopic life forms within a niche and all of the things that they need to sustain themselves. But I think when I think about a microbiome, I incorporate into that definition two other key dimensions. The first is evolution. So there is an evolutionary partnership. Microbes existed before we existed. They have formed, so much of our biology, informed it, and we have co-evolved, with them, and therefore they have influenced it. So that relationship has existed over evolutionary timescales. But time is also important because that symbiosis changes and is dynamic across the time course of our own lives. So from the minute we're conceived to the minute that we die, and actually beyond our death. So I think about those things in a way which I think will probably inform our discussion that we're about to have. And then you asked about symbiosis. So symbiosis, for your listeners that aren't fully aware, is if you like, a relationship between two different species that is mutually beneficial. At least that's how we particularly conceive of it. We conceive of it as one microbe existing within another or coexisting with another, and the partnership they have is mutually beneficial. And the symbiosis, actually, we can think about in a number of different ways. That symbiosis might often be beneficial, but actually sometimes it can be harmful. And an example of that might be a parasite. Most people know what a parasite is. It's a small organism living within you, maybe, that causes harm. But it sometimes may not be beneficial, or it may not be harmful. It might sit somewhere in between. So it might be what we call, it might be commensalistic. So it doesn't really seem to necessarily benefit anybody, or it might be amensalistic, i.e. it harms one and not the other. And the nuance of this symbiosis is quite important, because there's no such thing really as good and bad bugs. Good and bad bugs is a sort of general kind of over simplification of what's going on. There's pathogens, bugs that harm us, that cause disease, that are really problematic. And there's mutualists, bugs that live within us, that are symbiotic. But of course, if you treat mutualists badly, if you treat bugs badly enough, or you make their environment strained and stressful enough, ultimately they might cause you harm. So that the nature of that symbiosis is extremely dynamic, and it's so important to understand, to answer your question finally at last, is because that symbiosis informs how our organs develop. Everything from how our brain develops through to our gut. And so if you don't have that symbiosis set up and informed correctly, having health consistently across the duration of our lives becomes really very difficult.
I think what the listener, and certainly me when reading your book, going in didn't appreciate was how the gut is so other to the self. Symbiotic relationship between a whale and a small fish that eats whatever it is on its fin seems obvious, but looking at the gut as this whole other entity that isn't you, it's something else, full of lots of foreign invaders, was an interesting first lesson, which sort of framed the whole book quite well for me.
Well, I think what I was trying to do was to paint this picture of a universe within, and it literally is a universe within, because it exists at a massive scale. It's just at a scale that is really hard for us to conceive or to conceptualize, because we can't see it, and because it doesn't exist in most of our scientific textbooks or medical textbooks or health literature. So, just to give you a sense of scale, and there's lots of kind of these facts that get rolled out with the microbiome, but, there's about 100 trillion microbes within you, which is the same total number of cells that make you as a human. And the thing that really bakes my noodles is the whole genomics of it. So there's probably about, 25,000 genes that code proteins that make you, Ben. And you've probably got 30 million microbial genes that are functioning as part of that symbiosis within you. So philosophically, you're not really a human. You're really like a meta-human or a superorganism. You're the sum of all of that genomic interaction between those microbes and your genomes. And I think, you know, that's quite a profound philosophical shift when you think about what human health really is. The other point I sort of make is that obviously, I mean, I'm a colorectal surgeon. I'm a surgeon, right? I spend my whole day operating on the bowel, and I'm hugely biased to the importance of the bowel. The bowel's like really, really key. But actually, these microbial partnerships exist throughout the body. They're not really necessarily gut-centric. The largest is within the gut very much, but you have a microbiome on your skin, you have a microbiome in your lung, you have a microbiome, you know, in the urogenital tract, and these things are equally as important in defining our health. And of course, they're all linked, they're all networked together.
So when that symbiotic relationship goes wrong or something goes out of whack, this is where you come in your day job, where you're a surgeon. You said a colorectal surgeon.
Yeah.
How much of what you operate on is preventable?
Oh, I'd say probably, you know, 95%. I mean, I think so. For those of you that haven't hung out with many colorectal surgeons, I mean, the question I often get as a colorectal surgeon is like, why? Like, why are you doing this job? And the majority of my job is treating bowel cancer. And what we know about bowel cancer is that the majority of bowel cancer is sporadic. By that, what I mean is it happens through a random gene mutation that causes the cancer. It's not because you've necessarily inherited a dominant gene, which just means you're definitely going to get it. We know that probably about 25% of those cancers probably happen because of some sort of familial environmental interaction that increases your risk or predisposes your risk. But the majority are what we call sporadic, so they just happen seemingly randomly. And what we know is that a lot of the benign diseases that I also operate on occur because of probably these, gene environment interactions. So therefore, what you eat, what you drink, how you live your life, the lifestyle choices you make are incredibly important determinants of that risk. And what we know is if you go to different parts of the world, that risk changes very dramatically. So if you're in London, your risk is very high. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa and you live in a rural environment and you have buckets of fiber, you just don't get bowel cancer, right? So we know that there are major environmental drivers of it. And the final thing to say is that we know that the epidemiology of a lot of the diseases that I'm operating on is really dynamic and changing very, very dramatically. So bowel cancer, for example, you're 4 times more likely to get bowel cancer if you're a millennial or you're a young person than you were if you're born in the 1950s or 60s. And that driver, that the explanation of that is not in your genes. It's not genetic. It's not something you're inherently predisposed to. Genes don't mutate and change that quickly. It has to be an environmental driver. And our hypothesis is that microbes are a very important determinant of all of this because they sit between the environment and your genes. They are the kind of middleman or the middlewoman. They are the intermediary. And therefore, if you don't understand them, you cannot explain these shifts in epidemiology. You cannot explain the shifts in chronic disease risk. And modern medicine or medicine in general actually has a kind of problem, which is that it tends to work in silos. So what that means is that surgeons tend to talk to mainly other surgeons, and they mainly only think about the diseases that they operate on or manage. But actually, if you work outside of a silo and you look more broadly across society and you look more broadly across the epidemiology of disease, what you see is that rise in the incidence of bowel cancer that I was telling you about in young people is not happening in isolation. What you're seeing is a very large change in the risk of lots of other non-communicable diseases that are generally modified by a change in the immune system. So that might be things like asthma, allergy, eczema. It might be changes like inflammatory bowel disease, but it might also be conditions like obesity, cardiovascular disease, and also conditions of the gut-brain, so mental health problems. And all of these things are changing. They're not changing in isolation. And when you look at the bigger picture, what I'm arguing is that the microbiome is an incredibly important determinant of those things across the board, because that symbiosis you were talking about at the start of our conversation is so fundamental. It's so critical to the development of our immunology and our immune systems, to our organ development, that if it's really significantly uh, uh, um, um, damaged, or if it's that symbiotic function is perturbed in some way, that you can't have a healthy immune system that can cope with living in an urban environment in 2024. It's really difficult for it to adjust.
So if rates of colon cancer, just actually quickly on vernacular, is colon and bowel cancer interchangeable?
Yeah, brilliant question. So yeah, we quite often mix our descriptive terms here, depending on whether we're speaking to like a lay audience or professional audience. But basically, I think of bowel cancer as predominantly affecting the colon, or what we call the large bowel. So your colon is about 1.5 meters long, and it's basically a giant fermenting engine, which is where the majority of our microbes really exist. And it's different from your small bowel, and your small bowel does a lot of the hard work in metabolizing and breaking down a meal that you might eat, for example. And when we talk about bowel cancer, we really mean tumors occurring in the large bowel.
Okay, so with increasing rates of bowel cancer and
Yeah.
a whole host of other things, why is that the case? And actually, first of all, yeah, why is that the case? Why the increase in rate? To start there.
It's a really interesting question. And the short answer is we don't know yet. But I'll tell you my theory about it. And it's my theory. And this is what I think is happening. I think so the cancer story is quite interesting in terms of the microbiome more broadly. What we are beginning to understand is that there are very particular microbes, or bacteria, I should say more specifically, that turn up in cancer. So tumors and cancers of the stomach and of the gastric tract and the bowel will often have bacteria that exist within the cancer. So we find them within the cells of the cancer. Cancers are not sterile in a classic sense. And we're beginning to understand what those bacteria are and how that those bacteria change the behavior of those cancers. But the problem with the microbiome is that if you're studying the microbiome when the disease has occurred, you're probably studying the disease long after the horse has bolted, because the microbiome plays a very important role in defining your risk, and probably many years or even decades before that disease has occurred. So to answer your question, what I think you need to do is to come back again to the very beginning of our conversation. I said to you that the microbiome has like these evolutionary and time components to it. And this is how I think about it. So what I think is happening is that actually there's 3 or 4 different hits that are happening in society that explain these observations. The first thing that you need to understand is that the microbiome influences your risk of cancer probably from the minute of conception, and that's through your risk, through the interaction of the maternal microbiome. So how microbes carried inside a gestating mother influence the health of the growing infant before they're born. And what we know is that that signaling that I sometimes refer to as kind of orchestral signaling, that we'll get into in a second, it's quite complicated, but it has a big molecular song that it sings to the growing infant. And if that song is perturbed for some reason, so for example through antibiotics or through obesity or through some other kind of environmental shift, the nature of that song changes and the risk changes. And we know that from good epidemiological studies. The second hit is what happens in the development of the microbiome in very early life. If that's changed in some particular way, that also seems to be quite important. So that might be, again, it might be that you perhaps are overexposed to antibiotics, or maybe there's something that happens that kind of shifts the evolution of the development of that microbiome within a baby before the age of 3 to 5. The third hit comes when you then exposed to a kind of westernized, globalized diet. And an urbanized lifestyle. So that means high fat, low fiber foods. It means perhaps being exposed to particular pollutants within an urban environment like a city. And of course, the microbiome then isn't set up to properly cope and deal with that. And the consequences of that microbiome that hasn't been set up either in pregnancy or in early life becomes much more magnified and much more significant. And what you end up is with immune dysregulation. And then that leads to a gene mutation, which causes the cancer. And then, of course, the cancer grows its own microbiome. And you find that it then predisposes to particular bacteria really growing into those cancers. So increasingly in our research group and in others around the world, when you're trying to really understand a disease like cancer, or in fact any chronic non-communicable disease, you've got to go right back to the formation of the microbiome in very early life if you're a microbiome scientist and you really want to understand what's going on.
Is that a is that determined? Does that early life context and experience sort of shape your future of your gut, or can you actually rectify it, if you pardon the fun?
I mean, it's a brilliantly interesting question. So the good news, and I think we should be optimistic, is that you absolutely can change it, and we've shown that very nicely in some of our research, and others research around the world have shown that. And actually, you can change that by doing many of the things that you and your listeners will already know how to do. So it is about making fairly simplistic changes to your diet and to your lifestyle. So, for example, really trying to change the amount of plant-based fibers that you eat, and that's kind of all over the lay press at the moment. But I think there's a kind of a bigger question here, which is that assumes that you're financially enabled to do that, that you're educationally enabled to do that, that you're not living in a socially disadvantaged system that doesn't allow you to make those changes. And I think that's where kind of microbiome science is probably most valuable. I believe it's science that allows us to prevent disease in a much more impactful and meaningful way, because it explains the mechanism through which very well established health prevention strategies actually work, and it's a tool for reinforcing behavior change and making them more sustainably changeable for individuals. But also, they can function as a policy instrument to try and create tools that better support, population level health. I think what you're seeing is and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a bit, is a very rapid global erosion in the microbiome, but not just the human microbiome, the planetary microbiome, to be honest. But actually, we've got to reverse that. And sometimes I refer to this as an internal climate crisis. We're basically experiencing an internal climate crisis. We're experiencing massive loss of our internal biodiversity and the functions of those microbes. And the solution to preventing cancer in young people, or to preventing this awful burden of mental health disease, or to preventing this kind of pandemic of immune-mediated diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory bowel disease, requires a solution on the same scale as climate change. You can't change this with a medicine and a bit of kimchi. It needs a radically different solution, because you're fighting something. You're fighting a problem on that scale.
And I imagine you need time as well. You can't, as you said, you can't just have a piece of kimchi and the climate crisis is solved.
Yeah,
And it's got to be consistent efforts. I'd love to double click on the antibiotics, because I think
sure.
I'm really confused as to, I can appreciate why they're needed, but I can also
Yeah,
understand that they're causing havoc on this internal crisis. I'd
yeah.
love to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I think probably at the top of my answer to that, I need to tell you that I'm not antibiotic, right? So I love antibiotics, because if I didn't have them, my patients would die. I mean, I'm a surgeon, and I'm entirely reliant on them, because the thing that is most likely to kill my patients is something called sepsis. And antibiotics have transformed outcomes, and they are hugely important medicines. And there are very well described problems with antibiotics in terms of antimicrobial resistance and our misuse of antibiotics, and how microbes are becoming very resistant to these very precious medicines. But the problem with antibiotics is that they have been willfully misused, not just by doctors, but by lots of other industries, notably, farming and the fisheries industry. Again, I'm not blaming farmers. Okay, so please don't. That's not the message here, because quite often actually it's farmer who's been evil, the evil party who's been mis-selling these products. And they were used again for really good reasons. They weren't used because farmers were lazy, but they were being used because in the 1940s, at the end of the Second World War, we had a starving country that couldn't feed itself. And from the early 1940s, it was very quickly understood by scientists that if you gave a chicken a bunch of streptomycin, that they got fatter much faster. They got to market weight much quicker. And antibiotics were actually sold as growth products. They were sold as antibiotic growth products to increase the weights of farm animals, and to improve not just animal husbandry, but actually the efficiency of farming as a method for feeding the world's rapidly growing population. And so 80% of the world's antibiotics are actually used in food production. They're not really used in the healthcare industry. And of course, antibiotics have been manufactured at a massive scale, and we consume huge amounts of them. So we now consume about 38 billion daily doses of antibiotics globally. And the majority of those antibiotics are not being consumed by you and I. They're being consumed in India and in China, and they're being consumed by young people, by children. And the consequences of that is very, very significant and poorly understood. So the first thing to say is that it's not just our microbiomes that are changing, it's the planetary microbiome that's changing, because antibiotics are in and they are everywhere. They're in our food, they're in our soil, they're in our water, and you can't really escape them. So it's actually shaping the planetary microbiome. It's not really just shaping ours. And the second thing to say is that we know from really good epidemiological studies that children are pretty much no different from a boiler, from a battery chicken, right? Like if you give your child lots and lots of antibiotics in early life, we know that their risk of obesity goes up. We know that their risk of diabetes goes up. We know that their risk of asthma goes up. We know that their risk of bowel cancer and adenomas go up. But we just keep giving the antibiotics. And this sort of comes to kind of a more fundamental point, really, and it comes to the philosophy of really what we're talking about. This isn't just about antimicrobial stewardship or improving education around antibiotics. It's about fundamentally shifting our approach to managing microbes more broadly. And to date, it's really grounded still in a 19th/20th century way of thinking about microbes, which is rooted in very transformative and important theories like germ theory, which gave us antisepsis and antibiotics and saved millions and millions of lives. And it saves those lives because the things that were most likely to kill you were pathogens. So, bugs that are going to cause you harm no matter what. And in the pursuit of killing all of those pathogens, we've inadvertently damaged all of those mutualists and symbionts that we want. So what I'm advocating for is that actually what we need is to move beyond germ theory into something that I'm calling microbiome theory, because I haven't got a better name for it yet, which basically says, look, yeah, you still need to kill pathogens. Pathogens are still really problematic globally. You need a solution to those problems. But at the same time, what you really need is microbial conservationism. You need to understand that actually health isn't just about not having pathogens. It's about having a really optimized, healthy, biodiverse universe of microbes within us that maintain our health, maintain that symbiosis, and allow our organs to develop, and allow our organs also to age effectively. And that in and of itself is an important health prevention strategy. So antibiotics, yeah, we need them. It's just that the ecological damage that they've done is really quite significant.
There's so many different places I want to go to this conversation. I'm trying to keep on my plan, but inevitably that goes out the window and tangents galore.
We'll see where we go.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that was a perfect segue into the sort of to a policy intervention. How I don't even know where you would begin, but in a sort of over-sanitized world, how do you even begin to have sort of microbial diversity and inclusion? I don't even know.
Well, I mean, so I think the good news is that we do know, and actually, the nice thing about the microbiome is that if you want to improve microbial diversity, it's relatively straightforward. Actually, you need to stop damaging it, which means that you need to properly legislate and regulate antibiotic misuse, which we're still not doing effectively in the United Kingdom. We were supposed to have done it after Brexit. We still haven't done it. We've seen countries that have much more progressive laws, like in Scandinavia and Norway, around, particularly antibiotics used in animal husbandry, where they've really been able to make very big changes. But it's also about how you educate and how you teach and how you bring this science into schools and into young people's education and view of the world. I think that's really, really important. And we still see in the United Kingdom, not enough emphasis being put on nutrition, diet, and healthy eating, in schools. It's still a huge problem. I think you might even argue that you could adopt strategies that are typically used in other aspects of climate, the climate response, whether that's kind of economic or financial instruments or financial incentives. I don't know. But what I do know is that, every time a big pharma company, makes a new antibiotic or makes a new drug, they're not having to offset the damage that they're doing to microbial
Mm.
communities. And that's because the microbes don't really form part of our climate response strategy at the moment. If you go and look back some of the COP meetings, the last one actually was quite good. They actually made a statement on antimicrobial resistance rates, but I still think they're really missing the point. Actually, antimicrobial resistance is just a biomarker for our damage that we've done to the microbiome. And actually what we need is much more progressive instruments for protecting it and for conserving it in the same way that you conserve a rainforest or a barrier reef. And at the moment that's just not in our framework at all.
Mm.
So I think it needs to come into the politics of it.
Some perverse incentives, and I don't know, how do you sort of tax those externalities, right?
I mean, I'm definitely, I'm not Greta Thunberg, but I'm definitely a bit of a radical on this. I mean, I think that you need to, I think you have to enshrine the protection of the microbiome in law some way. And I think the microbiome should be a basic human right. And I think particularly the maternal microbiome should be a basic human right, because, we're very good. Like, we've transformed, infant mortality through not just education, but through detecting and removing pathogens from pregnant women having babies, and it's worked really very, very well. But what we haven't done is said, well, okay, how do we optimize the microbiome, not just to ensure maternal health, but to ensure the infant's health, potentially over the entire duration of their life? Like, it just doesn't, at the moment, it's not something that anybody's really doing. So I think what we need is a measure, and perhaps this is an even more fundamental question, Ben, which is, do we have a measure of what a healthy microbiome really is and what it should really be? Can you define it? And if you can define it and can you measure it, can you say, look, every gestating mum has the right to have that? Because if you don't, actually their risk of having, a poor health outcome is significantly increased. And I think that's what we should be working towards.
Yeah. I imagine the issue is to have a one easy biomarker on this massively complex adaptive system is super hard. However, though, if someone could do that, I can see how the impact. Just
it's hard to do.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
The societal policy piece. I actually read the other day that there was a behavioral economic study went on in Australia, and they had 4 different interventions sent to general practitioners to try to reduce the unnecessary overprescribing of antibiotics. And the most effective intervention was intervention 4, which was what they called social proof plus graph, which was, did you know you're in the top 85% centile of GPs prescribing antibiotics? And then with a graph. And then apparently that reduced the rate of unnecessary prescription the most, which I thought was it's just an interesting
it's so interesting, isn't it? And I think that illustrates the point that actually we need to have a measure of what's happening, and we don't have a measure of what's happening. So we were talking about that just a second ago. I do perform microbiome analysis in my clinical practice now. It's quite controversial, and we can get into the weeds of microbiome analysis because it's not straightforward. But it's very, very impactful when you can show someone, when they take an antibiotic, what actually happens to their gut and to their microbiome, and you can objectively, see the impact of the damage it does.
What would we see?
And I find, well, it depends on a couple of things. So it depends. So we're talking about antibiotics like they're a homogenous thing, like they're all one entity, and they're not. There's lots of different types, and of course it depends a little bit on the dose that you give and the frequency of that dose and the duration of the prescribing. But what you will typically see with a medicine like a penicillin is you'll see quite a temporary change in the microbiome. Most penicillins, the microbiome will bounce back, actually. You'll see a loss of diversity, quite a dramatic loss of diversity. You can lose up to 40,000-fold of the microbes in your gut. So you'll get like a kind of a massive cull event. And then over about 4 to 6 weeks, it will kind of, the microbiome will bounce back. But if you give what we call a broad spectrum antibiotic, so an antibiotic that's designed to kill more different types of bacteria, you'll see a much more profound change. And what you see is that you see 2 things. You see, first of all, that the microbiome sometimes never comes back. So, and this has been studied and been published, and there's been a bunch of work done on this. So this isn't just my observation. This is kind of, peer-reviewed science. But you will see that it's not just that the microbiome shifts maybe forever in terms of its ecology, like who is there. It also changes in terms of its function. So what are these bacteria doing? Every single aspect of the microbiome changes. And in some, when it doesn't come back, I call it microbiome scarring. It's literally like you've kind of set fire to a rainforest and some green shoots come back, but basically the rainforest doesn't ever really grow back into the system it was before, that precise ecosystem it was before. And the second thing you see is you see winners and losers. So the difference really between bacteria and other kind of ecosystems is that microbes have this phenomenal ability to mutate and to share genes, right? They can share genes between different species and within the same species, and they can do this incredibly efficiently, which is how they're able to generate antimicrobial resistance so quickly, right? But what you see is you see winners and losers. So you'll see decimation of particular bits of the microbiome like your Firmicutes, and then you'll see blooms like super blooms in the Bacteroidetes, and that's quite often the driver of many of the symptoms that these patients will experience. And that's why when you've taken long-term antibiotics, you will see quite often non-specific symptoms that are kind of hard to explain. So, for example, maybe changes in your weight. Yeah, it's very interesting. And then what you might see is very, very dominant bacteria within the gut. So you'll see just one strain or one species, really just dominating the whole gut. And it becomes very clear when you can see that why patients are suffering so much. And so you can use that information if you're careful, if you're clever about it, because then that can inform nutritional, dietary, prevention, repopulation strategies for trying to correct it.
Talking about sort of, I guess, repopulation strategies, and correct me if this is wrong. I had no idea about fecal microbiota transfers. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, transplants or transfers. Yeah,
transfers.
You're
yes.
right.
It was it was super interesting to read, and I think the everyday person has no idea this sort of goes on or could be a potential intervention to help the microbiome. Can you explain the process and where it's currently used in medicine?
So it's as gross as you will think it is. It is, although it's becoming slightly more manageable. But effectively, fecal transplantation has been done for many, many years, for like thousands of years. So it was initially done by, famously by the Chinese. They used to give it as yellow soup 2,000 years ago as a treatment for travelers' diarrhea. And it was used in the 1600s in veterinary medicine, and it's been used actually, in the modern era, pretty much from the 1950s. There was a guy called Ben Eisman who started to give fecal transplants in the US. He was a naval surgeon for the treatment of what we might call a superbug today, or a hospital-acquired infection called Clostridium difficile. And this is a microbe that forms in the gut that makes you really sick. It gives you awful, awful diarrhea, terrible tummy pain, and it has a mortality rate. It can be really, really serious. Probably affects about 50,000 people each year in the United States. And generally, it's a condition caused by antibiotics. So before, I was just telling you, when you give an antibiotic, you get like a super bloom of these particular strains of bacteria. In this case, C. diff creates toxins and it makes you really, really unwell. So he said, if I take feces from a healthy person and put it into someone with C. diff, I wonder if it'll make them better. Lo and behold, it transformed them. They all got really well. And like all good things in modern medicine, we completely ignored it for another 50 years until the Dutch group said, I wonder if we could try this again, because we had a massive C. diff problem in the world at that point. We still do. And lo and behold, the data was extraordinary. Like, 90% of patients would get completely better. Compared to antibiotics, it was completely transformative, because seemingly, ironically, we treat C. diff infections with yet more antibiotics, right? So this was like a radical departure. And then it became slightly more into the modern sort of medical formulary. And in the United Kingdom now, it's now regulated and approved for the treatment of C. diff. So if you get C. diff and you're in hospital, your doctor might say to you, look, you should think about a fecal transplant. But the thing about fecal transplant is that taking feces from one animal species or one human and putting it into another is a very, very useful way for studying the microbiome. It's a tool that scientists have used for many, many years to try and understand the functions of particular microbes, because you can transplant a whole community, or you can transplant just a tiny bit of that community, so maybe a handful of species, and put that into a different animal and see what effect it has. And there it becomes much, much more interesting, because fecal transplant, it turns out, you can transfer lots of kind of crazy different traits and symptoms. So, for example, in some of the most famous studies in about the early 2000s, they were able to take twins who were genetically identical, but one was obese and one was lean. And if you took feces from the obese twin and you put it into an animal, like a rat, the rat would become obese. And that's because, of course, it's the microbes that are regulating inflammation in that animal's gut, and they're helping you very efficiently metabolize lipids. And then if you take the feces from the lean twin and you put that into the same animal, the animal will become lean again. And it suddenly opened the floodgates. People thought, well, hang on, what else is the microbiome involved in here, and what other roles does it have? And what we've seen now is a kind of massive escalation in fecal transplantation studies, and everything from gut-brain interactions, studying autism, through to studying drug addiction, mental health problems, to hair loss, to adjuncts as chemotherapy. And we now have well over 400 randomized controlled trials happening across the world, trying to understand its mechanisms and how it works. And it's very interesting because it seems to be very transformative in particular settings. And I'll give you one example, right? So there is a cancer, particularly awful cancer called melanoma, a skin cancer. And this used to be really a death sentence, 10 years or so ago. But now a class of medicine has transformed outcomes, and it's a form of immunotherapy. So it's a medicine that affects the way your immune system is able to see and detect and kill cancer. And the particular medicine has got a checkpoint inhibitor. And there was a study done about a few years ago now in the United States where they looked at patients with melanoma that had spread around the body, and they had initially responded to these medicines called checkpoint inhibitors, and then they'd stopped responding. And now the cancer was progressing and they were going to die. And there was nothing that could be done because that was the last drug in the armory, and there were no other choices. And what they decided to do was to take these 16 patients and give them a fecal transplant. If I take feces from a healthy person who doesn't have melanoma, who's well, and I put that into these patients, will it change the way that the drug responds, or the cancer responds to the drug? And in half of those patients, it did. The cancer suddenly switched onto the drug again, and the drug worked, and the cancer regressed, and those patients went on to do a bit better. And so suddenly there's this understanding that actually fecal transplantation might have some quite impactful roles as an adjunct to medical therapy, for example. And we're now seeing an explosion in these studies.
Could you speak to? I mean, it's so fascinating to hear about it. And could you speak about the more about the potential, and maybe a segue into inflammation? Because you have a lovely example in your book on what was it, blood marrow donations, and how there's potential around fecal transfers being helpful for. I think it was leukemia in the book. Was the example of they've received bone marrow, and that could be a helpful intervention.
Yeah, so I can absolutely talk about that, because we've got a trial. My colleagues Ben Mullish and Julia Marchese at Imperial are running a trial on patients having stem cell therapy for blood-based cancers, so bone marrow transplants, basically. And the problem with some of these patients is that when you do that, the immune system will attack itself, and it can make you really, really sick. And it can cause failure of the graft, and it can sometimes be fatal. It's called graft versus host disease. And what's interesting is that the diversity of the bugs in your gut seem to predict who's going to get graft versus host disease and who doesn't. And in fact, some scientists have been able to derive urine tests which measure the particular functions of bugs in the gut to predict whether or not you're likely to get it. And the interesting thing is that you can change your risk of it through fecal transplantation. So what I find really interesting is these patients are super sick. They're really, really unwell, and their immune system is just totally non-functioning. And the idea, most of that's because doctors suppress it, but we give these patients so many antibiotics because we're so frightened of bacteria, because bacteria cause sepsis and they kill these poor patients. Yet fecal transplant in these patients seems to be really quite safe. Like, you give it and it doesn't cause overwhelming sepsis, and it's totally back to front. It shouldn't make any sense. But also, when you correct the diversity in these patients, it seems to significantly reduce their risk of graft versus host disease. But also what it does is flushes out all of those antimicrobial resistance genes in the body that have stopped many of the antibiotics that doctors need to give when they really need to give them. So it reduces the risk of coming to harm. And then when you do need to give medicines because of infection, because that may still ultimately happen, actually, the antibiotics that you've got to give are much, much more effective. So that's a really good example of like how we're using them in kind of mainstream kind of clinical practice for therapeutic effect.
Wonderful. I really it was an optimistic your book's wonderfully optimistic, but that section in particular I really enjoyed because it was I know a few people who've have that disease. I can't forget the name, but organ host disease, and
Graft versus host disease.
Exactly
It's brutal.
that.
It's awful. It destroys lives. So it's really nice to see that we can apply microbiome theory in a really practical way, and it's exciting to see that data. So, well, fingers crossed for Ben and Julian's trial. I hope it shows what we need to do.
Well, we'll have to follow on and and keep up with their work. Shifting gears slightly, my lovely partner Eloise, she I don't know if she knew that when she chose me as a potential, mate, whatever you want to call, that my microbiome was a big determinant in that, and that was news to me. I thought it was some dodgy cologne I bought at the airport, or who knew. But what role does the microbiome play in, I guess, mate selection and how we choose a partner?
Yeah. So I think it plays more than we think it does. And again, like I'm going to come back to the beginning of our conversation. Like if you go into kind of the theory of evolutionary biology, microbes have played quite an important role in the evolution of sex as a sort of method of reproduction. And again, in the evolution of kind of mating rituals and mating behaviors. And some of that is in kind of obvious ways, and some of it's more subtle and nuanced ways. So if you go to other animal species, for example, like the panda bear, microbes produce quite a lot of the pheromones that allow them to attract mates. And I think I use in the book this example of the fruit fly. So the fruit fly will mate based on pheromones, and if you give the fruit fly antibiotics, it simply can't find a mate. What's super interesting about it is that if you give it a single strain probiotic, it will, which is a probiotic, and maybe we'll talk about it, is a living bacteria that you drink that has an established health benefit, right? If you give it a single strain antibiotic, so just one particular species of bacteria, it will switch on its ability to produce pheromones again, and it can mate. And of course, what we also know is that hormones, so a lot of our sex hormones that influence quite a lot of our sexual behaviors, are also very heavily influenced by the microbiome at lots of different levels. So they influence the production and the bioavailability of these hormones, and therefore their effect. So like raging teenagers, out at the moment, their microbiome is playing a role. And social behavior. So we know, like teenagers, for example, who have big social networks, like real world networks, not digital networks, have a more diverse microbiome, and they're and therefore that's more likely probably to influence some aspects of sort of traditional traits that we might associate with beauty or attractiveness. So the microbiome plays a very important role, for example, in skin health, or it plays a very important role in how smelly you are, right? So whether or not you're producing lots of body odor. So actually, Ben, that your fragrance that you're purchasing probably was quite important. So we think it's probably more important than people assume.
Well, it's I really enjoyed that chapter as well. It was fascinating, and I like the I guess it's sort of your hormones are downstream from your gut health in some way. And there's a nice study where they gave a group of men, you've probably heard of it, they on the track sweated in their t-shirt, and they gave some unsuspecting females the shirts, and actually the mate selection was down to what essentially would be a good evolutionary fit for their genes, which is my layman's interpretation of the abstract of the study.
I think it's a good interpretation, and I think it's probably right. There's lots of sort of there's lots of biological cues that we probably don't really detect. So like rats, for example, will avoid mating with animals that have parasites because they can smell some of the molecules that these mates produce in the urine of their, in their urine. So they will avoid that's how they know to avoid mates. Maybe we do the same. I don't know. It's just not really within our lexicon. I think the other kind of point I wanted to talk about in terms of, maybe you were going to ask about it, I don't know. I think sex is important because we think about sex in terms of we think about sexual health, at least in terms of preventing the transmission of pathogens that cause harm, right? And it causes a lot of harm. Like, you have 80 million STIs in the United States each year, and these STIs often have very significant impacts on your risk of chronic health problems. So, HPV and cervical cancer, for example, or anal cancer. But we don't think about it in its distribution of microbiomes and healthy microbiomes, and its importance in that sense. So when you kiss someone, for example, you transfer probably about 80 million bacteria with each kiss, and actually, it's an important way of not just maintaining your microbiome, but also a diverse microbiome prevents you from it can prevent you or alter the risk of harm that comes from being exposed to a pathogen. And we see this like in people with HIV. Like, HIV and the microbiome have this very, very dynamic and close relationship. And it's not just that a diverse microbiome seems to be more protective. It changes the way that medical therapies that we give to treat some STIs also work. And it has very significant implications in reproduction and reproductive health beyond that. So particularly infertility, for example. We know that the vaginal microbiome is an increasingly important determinant of infertility. And actually, the males are no different. So again, the penile microbiome and also our spermatic microbiome is also very important. And in fact, because we can think about human health as a sort of connected system, the gut microbiome also has a role in determining things like sperm function and sperm health, for example, because it influences bile acid metabolism, which influences vitamin A function, which influences the function and growth of sperm. So the microbiome is an important determinant, not just in our ability to identify and select a mate. It's an important determinant of our sexual health more broadly, but also our ability to reproduce. And that's important because reproduction, fertility rates are declining dramatically globally. Like, they're falling off a cliff, and we don't really know why. And we started our conversation talking about like bowel cancer and joining up the dots. And I'm arguing you need to put that in the same bucket. Like, infertility rates are falling for a reason. And I think the thing that joins it all together is our internal climate crisis.
It's funny. I mean, you mentioned the sort of the siloed nature of medicine, and when you zoom out, you can sort of connect the dots a bit. Weirdly, through this podcast, you speak to loads of different experts, and the thing I've learned is I have a hunch a lot of them are speaking about the same thing upstream of their specific field. So, why are dementia and Alzheimer's rates increasing rapidly? And it's a symptom of is it a symptom of the modern world or the environment? And it's just interesting to sort of spot common threads as to what the root cause of these things is. The root cause of a lot of these health issues and things like infertility and the physical side can start in the gut, as we've discussed. The mental side of the equation as well. The gut gets thrown about as the second brain and the brain gut axis. I'd love to speak of what role the gut plays in mental health, and just explore that for a bit.
Yeah. So I share an office in the hospital where I work at Imperial with a brilliant surgeon called Emma Carrington. She's like, "Oh, James, the microbiome's just involved in bloody everything, isn't it? Like, she thinks it's involved in everything." And I'm always having to defend myself. And I think it is, right? Because I think it's so profound. I think it's as important as your genome. Like, we all understand that the genes that we're delivered into the world with define our health in some way, and it might be that those genes are modified and transformed to a degree, but nonetheless they're important determinants of our health. We know that the environment is an important determinant of our health. What I'm arguing is that the microbiome is as fundamental as those two things. As I mentioned earlier, it sits between them. So I think about gene, environment, microbiome interactions, right? I think that's how I think about kind of human health, and I think it is that profound. And therefore, when you talk about mental health or you talk about brain development, it's as applicable. And I think what we need to distinguish here is, when we're going to talk about the brain, is probably distinguish problems of brain development or neurodevelopment from problems of brain or neurological degeneration, so the problems of aging, versus the problems of mental health, so psychiatric, disease or mental health problems. And I think, again, they're all, clinically and biologically discrete and different things, but they do have some commonality, which is neuroimmunobiology. So it's how the immune system influences the health, growth, development, and functions of nerves in our brain, in our gut. And the microbiome is therefore important because the microbiome is like the puppeteer of them. It's the puppet master. It's pulling the strings on the immune system. Therefore, it's very significantly influencing all of these things. So, for example, we talked about fecal transplant earlier. So some quite nice studies looking at the microbiome and problems in neurodevelopment that have leveraged fecal transplant to prove some theories. So if you take the same model that I described with obesity, so you take genetically identical twins, one has autism, one doesn't have autism, and you do a fecal transplant model where you take the feces from the autistic twin and you put it into an animal, that animal will develop autistic behaviors. Again, you can correct them. The really interesting bit is if you take the feces from the twin that doesn't have autistic spectrum condition, and you put it in, the behavior will be corrected. Wow. What's even more interesting is that effect is only found up until the point that animal is weaned. So what that means is that there is a moment where there's a cutoff where those systems are set, like you can't, or changing them is really, really difficult. And increasingly, I'm of the opinion that maybe that change in humans, it could be very, very early in life. It could be when you stop weaning. But I think also puberty is super important as well in that development, particularly in gut symptoms and particularly in symptoms of chronic pain that are commonly associated with things like IBS. So what we're beginning to understand is how that happens and how microbes are influencing that function. And I think in this world, what you're going to be speaking to specialists about who know a lot more about this than I do increasingly is going to be about a particular line of cells called microglia or macroglia. They're big and small cells that basically are, if you like, the immunological gatekeepers of the nervous system. And again, when you have antibiotics in early life, you really profoundly disrupt the development of these particular immune cells. And what's super interesting to me anyway is that these things seem to happen in a sex-dependent way. So men and women will have a different impact of the antibiotic disruption on the microglial functions, and that's because hormones are connected to how all of these things work. So I think the language, if you like, the molecular language by which microbes influence brain development and brain function is slowly being unpicked. And what's exciting about the microbiome is that it's something that you can do something about. You can change it, you can access it, and you can change it.
That is a perfect segue to my next question, which is I like the old adage, invert always invert, and you sort of sometimes you find the right answer by avoiding the wrong answer. So if we wanted to hypothetically destroy a person's gut and do the opposite of optimize, what would we do on a daily basis to give ourselves the worst microbiome we possibly could?
Oh, it's pretty straightforward. You'd live in London, New York, or Paris, or you might even live in Shanghai, or you'd live in Beijing, or you'd live in Delhi, or you'd live in Qatar. You'd live in a big city, and what you would do is you'd all eat the same food, and that food would have almost no plant fibers in it. It would have lots of animal fats and salts and ultra processed foods. And what you'd do is you'd deliver a child into the world, and you'd really hammer them with antibiotics, probably from the minute they're conceived, certainly through the early phase of their life until about the age of 3 to 5. And then what you'd do is you would socially isolate them so that they had a very small network of real friends that they could play with and share microbes with. You probably wouldn't vaccinate them because that would increase your risk of antibiotic prescribing. And then what you would do is you would stop them from ever seeing an animal or having any form of interaction with any species other than humans. And they certainly would go outside very, very rarely. And the environment that you would grow them in the house that you lived in would probably have no plants in it, and it would be kept very, very sterile. So you would obsessively clean and wash absolutely everything. and you would think that all microbes were really, really bad. And then what you would do is you would put them in a very, very expensive, unsustainable healthcare system, where every time their system failed, what you would do is you would give them a treatment that made the destruction of their ecology, which was already very badly damaged, even worse. And you would keep doing that on repeat until they were about 105, when they were in a care home where all of these same behaviors would be repeating. And you would spend as much money as you possibly could sustaining this system. And you wouldn't change it.
We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we do. But actually, again, like the solutions to this, like, are not medical. The solutions to this are not through doctors, and they're not through me prescribing medicines. The solutions to this are societal, political, economic. They are about behavior change. And that's why I phrase this as a climate crisis, like an internal climate crisis. Like this shouldn't, be in the hands of hospital medics to fix this. This is definitely not the solution to the problem here. And it's about reframing this discussion as something which is a sustained assault on these critical evolutionary partnerships, which, until antibiotics came along in the 1940s, you could argue that there are some other important, global influences on it. Of course there are. But, it's dramatically changed in 70 or 80 years. And until we're really keen to address that, the behaviors will just keep repeating themselves.
James, I can speak to you all day. It's a very deep rabbit hole that goes on and on and on, and a really important one, as hopefully our listeners would have figured out today, as I have. I've got some quick fire questions to finish, if I may.
Go for it. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so in the last 5 years, what interventions, that could be health, that could be diet, that could be exercise, could be anything, have you incorporated into your life that have been the most effective?
So I became vegetarian, and I started measuring my microbiome, and I started trying to practice what I preached. I'm not an angel. And in my book, I've tried to acknowledge that, I'm doing the very best that I can in a difficult situation like we all are. But those were definitely changes that I made. I've really tried to exercise regularly, right? So particularly as I got to my 40s, I decided that really what I wanted to do was to reconnect with my friends and to start to reinvest in my meaningful kind of social real world network. Like, to me, it suddenly became very important. I've got 2 kids, they've grown up a little bit. I think many people in their 30s and perhaps in their 40s, and they've got young kids, feel quite isolated. But I felt, the biggest problem that we've really got in society at the moment is loneliness. I thought, you know what, I need to really focus on that, because I felt that would be good for my mental health, it would be good for all aspects of my health. And if I could build that around exercise, that would also be really, really good. So I then started to try and exercise socially with my friends. And then I did that whole mammal thing and got into cycling. And actually it was really, really good. Like, I stopped drinking out. Well, that's not true. I drank a lot less alcohol. I was eating much better. I was really thinking about my dietary health, because I was trying to perform in a kind of very middle-aged, slow way, and being with people and kind of prioritizing that in my life. I mean, obviously I try and prioritize my family. That's a given, but I've definitely tried to do that. And these are changes that they're not rocket science. They're changes that many and all of your listeners, I'm sure, are probably already doing. I'm not necessarily advocating vegetarianism. I don't think you need to be a vegetarian to have a healthy microbiome or to live a healthy life. But I just felt that sustainable eating, I think, is now all of our responsibility. I fall off the wagon. There'll be a picture somewhere of me eating a sausage. I'm not a saint, but I try and do those things because I think it's kind of practicing a little bit more what I teach. But the other thing that I do is I try and take regular inulin. I take a regular prebiotic fiber, because I find that sometimes that's kind of quite hard. I don't take regular probiotics, but I will if I need one. I did actually stick a bunch. My daughter, loves to cook, and so we try and make our own fermented foods. I try and have fermented foods regularly. I definitely try and put that into into my diet. She's always making me kimchi pasta, and I was being a bit mean about kimchi, but I quite like it. And so I try and do those simple things to try and really help.
Okay, wonderful. And has there been a book that shaped your worldview? One most impactful book for you?
Yes. Oh, yeah, brilliant. Yeah, totally got nothing to do with anything that we've just talked about,
Perfect.
which is really bad. Shoshana Zuboff, Surveillance Capitalism, completely changed my viewpoint on the world. I think she's a genius, and it's really about how companies like Google, Meta, etc., leverage our data to to create a second economy from which we do not benefit. And actually, it's interesting because I think this is actually very pertinent to the conversation we've just had, because actually that same capitalistic strategy is, I'm not a socialist or a lefty by any stretch, right? I'm an entrepreneur and I get involved in businesses, but I think it's a real problem for microbiome science. What you've got at the moment is companies at the moment really trying to mine the microbiome, lock it down and commercialize it. So you've got Silicon Valley basically just trying to do a land grab and to protect that intellectual property so we can't use it for the greater good of humanity. And if we've got a problem like a climate crisis, actually, that's a terrible thing. What you want is open data sets in the same way that we protected the human genome, so that you can have real diversity in your solutions to the problem, and you can incentivize industry startup and innovators to really use that data at scale in a really important way. So that she really informed my thinking, and I found that to be really quite a transformative book.
Wonderful. I'll check it out. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
there's a lot of like entrepreneurial activity in this space at the
yeah,
moment, especially around,
yeah,
I guess the quantification of the human
yeah,
body. It feels like,
yeah.
continuous glucose monitors have happened.
And
How
look,
can you quantify that?
I'm involved in it, right? So I'm interested in how you apply that to clinical practice. I'm interested in how you create personalized therapies that leverage the microbiome. I'm interested in how you develop, how you scale FNT, and I work with industry and I work with companies. So I don't think industry is a bad thing. I don't think commercialization is a bad thing. In fact, I'm very pro it. It's a really good way of scaling. But I just think the fundamentals upon which those industries are based, namely data, needs to be open access, and it needs to be free, because otherwise you end up with a monopoly or an oligopoly, even worse, and that's not a good thing for us. But my whole conversation is that diversity is a good thing, right? Biodiversity is very, very good in our microbiology, in our gut. It's very, very good in our society, in our workplaces, in our schools, in our offices, and it's very, very good in economics. And I think it's a general, truism.
One of when I set up my first business, I was reading the current Satya Nadella's book.
Oh yeah.
And at the end of it, he says, "What's your data strategy? Whatever your business, if you don't have one, you need one." And I remember thinking, "Oh, great! What a great insight!" And then thinking, "What a dangerous thing to say to the world."
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be reassessed a little bit.
He's an interesting bloke. As an aside to this conversation, I took him on a virtual ward round once. We were doing a bunch of work. I work at Imperial, and I have, I wear a bunch of hats, and we were doing some work on the HoloLens system when it came out during COVID, because we created digital PPE. So you could take a whole ward round just through a HoloLens headset, and it was quite effective. And so I took him on a ward round of my hospital. I
Cool.
quite liked him. It was a nice bloke. But yes, I think the world is like going through like a massive transformation. We've talked about the microbiome, but of course AI and computing is the tool that's going to unlock it. Because when you've got system complexity like you have in the microbiome, like overwhelming system complexity, we've talked about a universe of microbes inside of us. Humans are very bad at identifying patterns, but also you've got very, very complicated mathematical problems to solve, like how you link a gene to a metabolite to a protein to a bacteria, and how all of those things connect is kind of overwhelmingly complicated. And AI is going to unpick that. I'm completely sure of that. So actually, really, microbiome science is a computational problem, and it's going to be highly relevant.
I guess the irony is if you need a relevant data set for that AI to be trained on, which comes full circle, I guess.
It does indeed. Yeah.
Maybe it's a separate conversation.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
look forward to coming back. We'll have another chat about that, Ben. No, anytime.
Oh well, that's super kind, really kind, and
Yeah.
yeah, it'd be an absolute privilege. Last question from me is: if you could know one thing that's going to happen over the next 10 years with regards to the microbiome, if you could wave a magic wand and have the conclusions to X or Y study, what would it be?
That's so interesting. I'll answer your question, but I was talking about this with one of my colleagues the other day, and the thing that we were debating is whether or not we can really ever know everything about the microbiome. There might just be things in the microbiome that we just will never know. We can't know it because either system complexity is just too great, or we just simply can't access it, or we can't create experimental systems where we could really study the microbiome at the kind of critical time points and the critical bits of the body that we really need to understand. And so there might just be bits that are unknowable. And maybe it's better just to accept that we can't know them and focus on the bits that we can know. I think for me, the most exciting area at the moment is in neuroimmunobiology, and I really want to know in 10 years very precisely how the microbiome influences brain development and brain degeneration, because I think these are really critical global problems at the moment. You've got an aging population that is living with an excessive burden of chronic, non-communicable disease and a poor quality of life, and optimizing brain health is just going to be so important. And we've just got no treatments that are really effective. Like, you get a trial published and really it's a marginal gain. It's not transformative. So if we can unpick that in the next 5 to 10 years, I think you can really shift into disease prevention, which we've never been able to do in brain health before, right? And you can do that in a very, very targeted way. And to me, I think that would be transformative. I think I want to know that I can live my life as hopefully I'll live a little bit longer, but when I get older, I can have my my brain intact and to be able to enjoy my life. So that, I think, would be really important.
Oh, me too. Me too. Well,
Yeah.
as I said earlier, James, I really appreciate you coming on, and that was a real privilege for me. I so enjoyed speaking to you. I recommend listeners to pick up a copy of Dark Matter. It's my favorite book I've actually read this year. The subtitle is The New Science of the Microbiome. And
that's really kind of you.
Well, where else can we follow you and keep up with your work?
Yeah, I left Twitter in a rage, in an Elon Musk inspired rage. So you can find me on Instagram. Which is, I think, forgive me for swearing, but I think it's a good shit microbiome. You can find me at dark-matter.org.uk. We're trying to create some kind of citizen science projects and some public engagement projects. If you sign up to the email letter there, we'll keep you in touch. And I'm around. You'll find me if you need me.
Wonderful. We'll look forward to seeing more of you. And yeah, thanks once again. Have a great day.
Cheers, Ben. You too. Lovely to talk to you.